Alright, so before we start this video, I gotta say something real quick. It's actually my first time properly doing one of these videos with my own voice. Usually I'd be behind the scenes with some AI, but honestly, I kinda just wanted to try this out. So yeah, if it kinda sounds awkward at certain points, just ignore it for now. But anyways, I was kinda thinking about this earlier, and this what if actually changes way more than I originally thought. Because imagine this for a second. What if Monkey D. Luffy was actually raised by the Marines? Not temporarily, not trained for like a week by Monkey D. Garp. I mean fully raised by them. Growing up around Marine bases, learning justice before piracy, being taught that pirates are the enemy from the moment he could walk. Because if we're being honest, Luffy becoming a pirate was not guaranteed. If anything, Garp almost prevented it multiple times. And if just one thing changed, the entire world of One Piece could have looked completely different. So yeah, let's get right into the video. Our story still starts in Fuchsia Village. Shanks and the red-haired pirates still show up. Luffy still follows them around non-stop, and he still eats the gum-gum fruit by accident. The Sea King incident still happens too, and Shanks still sacrifices his arm to save him. But after that moment, things start changing immediately. Because in canon, Garp mostly laughs off Luffy's obsession with pirates even though he clearly hates it. He throws him into the mountains with Dodon, hopes he toughens up, and somehow expects things to magically work themselves out later. But this version of Garp reacts very differently. The second he sees Luffy standing there talking about becoming a pirate like Shanks, he realizes the situation is getting out of control. And from Garp's perspective, it makes complete sense. The future grandson of the hero of the Marines is running around idolizing pirates before he's even old enough to properly fight. So instead of leaving Luffy around the mountain bandits most of the time, Garp starts dragging him directly into Marine ships and bases while he's still really young. And at first, this goes horribly wrong, because Luffy does not fit in with the military life at all. You basically have this tiny chaotic kid running around some of the most disciplined places in the world, causing problems every single day. He steals food from the kitchen, climbs into cannons he isn't supposed to touch, sneaks into restricted rooms just because somebody told him not to go inside, and constantly challenges random soldiers to fights. Half the Marines stationed around him think he's completely insane. The other half somehow end up liking him anyway. Because even though Luffy causes non-stop trouble, there's also something weirdly lovable about him. He's fearless, says exactly what's on his mind, and somehow treats regular soldiers and high-ranking officers exactly the same. And that becomes really important later. Because unlike most people in the One Piece world, Luffy doesn't care about the status at all. Vice Admiral, Admiral, Recruit, Pirate, Noble, to him, they're just all people. And while that personality trait is funny when he's a little kid, it becomes a massive issue once he gets older. Now one thing stays exactly the same in this timeline. Luffy still hates being controlled. That part of him never changes. Once Ace finally leaves to become a pirate, things start getting really messy for Luffy. Because now this whole situation stops being some harmless argument between brothers and starts becoming personal for the Marines too. At first, most people around the Marine headquarters think Ace is just another rookie pirate who'll either get arrested eventually or disappear into the Grand Line like thousands of others. But that changes very quickly once Ace starts building a name for himself, because unlike normal rookies, Ace is ridiculously strong right from the beginning. Islands start hearing stories about this fire user destroying pirate crews, fighting Marine captains, and surviving impossible situations over and over again. And eventually, the reports reach Garp, which immediately creates a massive problem because now the hero of the Marines has two grandsons causing chaos around the world, except one is becoming famous inside the Marines, while the other is becoming famous outside of them. And people start talking, a lot. Some Marines quietly question whether pirate blood runs in the whole family. Others think Luffy might eventually follow Ace's path too. And once those rumors begin spreading, higher-ranking officers start watching Luffy much more carefully, especially Sengoku. Because Sengoku already sees dangerous similarities between Luffy and Roger. The charisma, the fearlessness, the way people naturally gather around him, all of it reminds him way too much of the Pirate King. And now Luffy's brother is becoming a rising pirate too. So from the government's perspective, the situation starts looking really bad. Once Ace finally leaves to become a pirate, things start getting really messy for Luffy. Because now this whole situation stops being some harmless argument between brothers and starts becoming personal for the Marines too. At first, most people around Marine headquarters think Ace is just another rookie pirate who will either get arrested eventually or disappear in the Grand Line like thousands of others. But that changes very quickly once Ace starts building a name for himself. Because unlike normal rookies, Ace is ridiculously strong right from the beginning. Islands start hearing stories about this fire user destroying pirate crews, fighting marine captains, and surviving impossible situations over and over again. And eventually, the reports reach Garp, which immediately creates a massive problem. Because now the hero of the Marines has two grandsons causing chaos around the world, except one is becoming famous inside the Marines while the other is becoming famous outside of them. And people start talking, a lot. Some Marines quietly question whether pirate blood runs in the whole family. Others think Luffy might eventually follow Ace's path too. And once those rumors begin spreading, higher-ranking officers start watching Luffy much more carefully, especially Sengoku, because Sengoku already sees dangerous similarities between Luffy and Roger. The charisma, the fearlessness, the way people naturally gather around him, all of it reminds him way too much of the Pirate King. And now Luffy's brother is becoming a rising pirate too. So from the government's perspective, the situation starts looking really bad. At the same time, Ace keeps trying to convince Luffy to leave the Marines behind completely. Whenever they secretly meet up again, the arguments between them get more intense every single time. Ace keeps telling Luffy the world government is rotten at its core, and that no amount of good Marines can fix that. Meanwhile, Luffy keeps pushing back because he's personally met soldiers who genuinely risk their lives to help innocent people. In his eyes, abandoning the Marines completely would also mean abandoning those people, and honestly, neither of them are fully wrong. That's what makes this dynamic so interesting. Because unlike canon where Luffy instantly rejects the government side of the world, this version of him is stuck in the middle. Part of him agrees with Ace, part of him still believes the Marines can become something better. But things start changing once Luffy finally sees the Celestial Dragons up close for the first time. Now this becomes one of the greatest turning points in the entire timeline. Because canon Luffy already hated seeing innocent people treated badly, but this version of Luffy grew up hearing Marines constantly talk about justice, honor, and protecting civilians. So when he sees the Celestial Dragons openly abusing people while Marines stand around doing nothing, it completely destroys his understanding of the system. At first, he genuinely thinks there's been some mistake. He expects somebody to step in. An admiral, a vice admiral, anybody. But nobody does, because they can't. And that makes Luffy furious. Not just angry, confused. Because in his mind, protecting innocent people should matter more than protecting status. So after the incident, Luffy starts arguing with the Marine officers constantly. He demands answers nobody can properly give him. Why are the Celestial Dragons allowed to own slaves? Why do Marines protect people like this? Why is the government allowed to ignore its own rules whenever nobles are involved? And every answer just makes him more frustrated. Because that's how the world works. Because they're the creators of the government. Because Marines follow orders. These explanations mean absolutely nothing to Luffy. And this is where the government starts realizing something terrifying. Luffy is not someone they can fully control anymore. At first, Sengoku tries handling the situation quietly. He assumes this is just a rebellious phase caused by Luffy's personality. But the more reports he receives, the worse the situation looks. Because Luffy isn't just questioning authority privately anymore. Other Marines are starting to agree with him. Young soldiers especially begin looking up to him more and more. A lot of them already disliked how the Celestial Dragons acted. But unlike Luffy, they were too afraid to say it openly. Now suddenly, Garp's grandson is standing there loudly saying exactly what they've secretly thought for years. And that is incredibly dangerous for the world government, because pirates threatening the government is normal, but Marines beginning to question the system from the inside, that's a nightmare. Meanwhile, Luffy's reputation keeps growing, not officially through the ranks or titles, but through stories. Stories about him ignoring orders to save civilians faster. Stories about him punching corrupt officers. Stories about him arguing directly with nobles. At one point, he probably gets sent on mission to protect some government official and ends up spending the entire time helping starving civilians instead. And somehow, this only makes ordinary people love him more. Because unlike many Marines, Luffy actually treats civilians like people instead of citizens under government protection. And eventually, even pirates start hearing stories about him. Some hate him because he's still technically a Marine. Others become curious because the stories don't sound like normal Marine propaganda at all. People start calling him weird things like the Pirate Marine, Garp's insane grandson, the rubber idiot who ignores orders. And the more famous he gets, the harder it gets for the government to quietly deal with him. Around this time, Luffy also starts becoming much stronger than most people his age, because unlike Kanon, he has years of combat experience fighting trained soldiers already. And since he's constantly around strong marines, he develops much faster physically too. At first, many officers think his devil fruit is weak, because it looks ridiculous compared to more destructive powers. But over time, people start realizing something important. Luffy's fighting style is almost impossible to predict. 1 second, he's charging directly at someone like an idiot, and the next, he's using his rubber body in ways nobody expects. And because he spent years around marine combat training, this version of Luffy is much more disciplined during fights compared to Kanon early on. He still improvises constantly, but there's actual structure underneath it now. And this becomes terrifying once he starts sparring with stronger opponents. Eventually, Luffy and Kobe both officially enter marine training programs together. And honestly, they become one of the strongest duos in marine history. Kobe becomes the hardworking, disciplined trainee everybody respects. Luffy becomes the chaotic monster nobody can control. And somehow the two still work perfectly together. Because Kobe handles strategy, planning, and discipline, while Luffy handles basically everything else through pure instinct and overwhelming force. The problem is that their success only pushes Luffy further into the spotlight. At one point, Vice Admirals probably start discussing whether Luffy could eventually become an admiral someday. And while that sounds exciting at first, it becomes terrifying once people realize what kind of admiral Luffy would actually become. It becomes terrifying once people realize what kind of admiral Luffy would actually become. Because unlike Aikanu, Aokiji, and Kizaru, Luffy would never blindly follow orders from the government. If he thought an order was wrong, he would ignore it immediately, and everyone knows it. Even Garp starts realizing the situation is getting out of control, because instead of turning Luffy into the perfect marine, all he really did was place the most rebellious person in the world directly inside the government, and now the rebellion is spreading. Things finally reach another major turning point once Luffy secretly meets Monkey D. Dragon for the first time. And this conversation completely changes everything, because unlike Kanon, Dragon already knows a lot about Luffy's life inside the Marines. He's been quietly watching from distance for years. And after hearing about Luffy questioning the government more and more, Dragon finally decides it's time to meet him directly. At first, Luffy is furious, because from his perspective, Dragon abandoned him completely as a child. But Dragon quickly shifts the conversation towards something much bigger, the world government itself. Dragon starts explaining things that the Marines never told Luffy. Corruption inside the government, entire countries suffering under celestial dragon controls, kingdoms destroyed for resisting authority. And suddenly, pieces start connecting inside Luffy's head. All those weird things he noticed growing up inside the Marines finally start making sense. And that conversation changes him permanently. Because for the first time in his life, Luffy starts realizing the problem may not just be a few corrupt people inside the government. The problem might be the system itself, and once the idea enters Luffy's head, there's absolutely no way the world government can stop it from growing. After meeting Monkey D. Dragon, Luffy starts changing fast, not outwardly at first. He still jokes around, still fights recklessly, still drives everyone around him insane on a daily basis. But mentally something shifts after the conversation. Because now every mission feels different. Every order feels different. Every time a superior officer tells him to ignore suffering civilians because it isn't government business, Luffy gets more frustrated. And the worst part is that he can no longer pretend the system is secretly good underneath all the corruption. Dragon completely destroyed that idea. So now Luffy feels trapped between two worlds. He still cares about Marines like Garp and Kobe, but at the same time he's starting to realize the government they serve might actually be impossible to fix from the inside. And that internal conflict only gets worse once he finally leaves Marine headquarters to travel on his own. Now, unlike Kanon, Luffy doesn't leave because he wants to instantly become Pirate King. At this point, he's still trying to figure out where he belongs. He just knows he can't stay inside Marine headquarters anymore, constantly listening to people blindly defend the government. So instead of officially abandoning the Marines immediately, Luffy basically sets out on an independent journey to see the world for himself. And this creates a really weird situation. Because technically he's still connected to the Marines through Garp, but at the same time he's acting more and more like a pirate already, meaning the government doesn't fully know what to do with him. Some officers think he's still loyal, others thinks he's becoming dangerous. And Sengoku starts receiving non-stop reports that Luffy interfering in situations without permission. The first major example happens with Roronoa Zoro, because unlike Kanon, Luffy already knows exactly who Zoro is before meeting him. Marine bases constantly spread stories about bounty hunters, and Zoro already has a reputation as somebody extremely dangerous despite not being a pirate. At first, Luffy is actually interested in arresting him, not because he hates him, but because he genuinely thinks dangerous fighters should be watched carefully. But the second he arrives at Shell's town and sees how corrupt Captain Morgan is, the entire situation changes. Because now Luffy sees something that completely pisses him off: a Marine officer abusing civilians while people are too scared to fight back. And this becomes a massive problem for the government because Luffy immediately turns against Morgan without hesitation. No permission, no orders, no concern for consequences. He just decides Morgan is wrong and starts fighting him right away. And while the civilians love this, the Marines are horrified, because from their perspective, Garp's grandson just publicly attacked a Marine captain. Now this is where Luffy and Zoro's relationship becomes really interesting, because unlike canon, Zoro doesn't instantly see Luffy as some goofy idiot with a dream. This version of Luffy feels different, more serious, more experienced, and honestly way more dangerous. Especially because he understands how Marines think already. At first, Zoro assumes Luffy is just another government dog trying to capture him. But after watching him openly fight Morgan to protect civilians, Zoro realizes something weird. Luffy doesn't act like a Marine at all. He acts like somebody following his own version of justice completely separate from the government. And that immediately earns Zoro's respect. Because more than anything else, Zoro respects conviction, especially from strong people. So instead of joining some random pirate captain chasing treasure, Zoro ends up following somebody who looks like he's slowly going to war with the entire system itself. And honestly, that sounds way more interesting to Zoro. Now the situation only gets crazier once news about Morgan spreads, because this becomes one of the first times the government realizes how dangerous Luffy actually is politically. It's not just that he attacked a corrupt officer, it's how he did it. The civilians start talking about him like a hero. Marines stationed nearby start questioning why Morgan was protected for so long. And suddenly people begin to ask dangerous questions again. Questions the government hates. How many corrupt officers are there? Why didn't Marine headquarters stop this earlier? If Luffy hadn't shown up, would anything have changed? And Sengoku immediately realizes the issue. Everywhere Luffy goes, people stop blindly trusting authority and start thinking for themselves, which is exactly what the world government does not want. Meanwhile, Luffy's reputation starts becoming really confusing across the seas. Some islands hear he's a Marine hero, others hear he attacked Marine officers. Some people think he's becoming a pirate, others think he's starting some kind of rebellion. And the weirdest part is that nobody can fully explain what side he's actually on, because even Luffy himself doesn't fully know it yet. He still helps civilians like a Marine, still fights pirates hurting innocent people, but he also keeps ignoring government authority whenever it clashes with his personal beliefs, and this starts attracting all kinds of attention. Pirates become curious about him, revolutionaries start watching him more closely, and certain Marines quietly begin admiring him, especially younger soldiers who already dislike government corruption. Things become even more complicated once Luffy meets Nami, because unlike canon, Nami is way more cautious around him. At first, she assumes Luffy is fully connected to the Marines because of how he talks about justice and because all of the rumors surrounding him. And honestly, she hates Marines almost as much as pirates at this point because of Arlong's control over her village and the Marines taking bribes to ignore it. So when Luffy starts talking about protecting people, Nami immediately assumes he's lying. But over time, she notices something strange. Luffy genuinely hates corruption. The second he finds out Marines have been helping Arlong by taking bribes, he becomes furious. Not because it breaks laws, because innocent people are suffering while the people supposed to protect them do nothing. And this becomes one of the first times Nami starts trusting somebody connected to the government at all. Because unlike every other Marine she's seen, Luffy actually puts people above the system itself. Now Arlong Park changes the entire East Blue conversation around Luffy. Because once Luffy defeats Arlong and exposes the corrupt Marines helping him, the government suddenly has a PR nightmare on its hand. Ordinary civilians love Luffy now. To them, he's becoming proof that good Marines still exist. But higher ranking officials are starting to panic because every major situation involving Luffy ends with the government looking worse. Morgan exposed, corrupt officers exposed, Marine bribery exposed, and now civilians are beginning to trust Luffy more than the actual system itself, which is unbelievably dangerous for the world government. Because institutions built on authority cannot survive people becoming loyal to individuals instead. And that's exactly what's happening with Luffy. At the same time, Luffy's strength keeps growing way faster than canon. Because unlike original Luffy, this version already has years of combat experience against trained fighters before entering the Grand Line. And once he starts fighting real enemies across East Blue, he improves even faster. What makes him terrifying isn't just raw power either, it's adaptability. because this version of Luffy combines marine combat knowledge with his completely unpredictable fighting style, meaning enemies can never fully prepare for him. One second he's fighting strategically like a trained soldier, the next he's launching himself through buildings like a complete maniac. And this weird mix makes him incredibly hard to deal with. Even experienced fighters struggle reading him. Around this time, the government finally begins seriously discussing whether Luffy needs to be stopped early. Not because he's evil, because he's inspiring people too much. And that becomes even more dangerous once Smoker finally meets him in Logtown. Because unlike many Marines, Smoker immediately understands Luffy. The second he sees him protecting civilians while openly disrespecting corrupt authority, Smoker realizes something important. Luffy isn't trying to destroy justice, he's trying to create his own version of it. And while Smoker would never openly support him at this point, he also stops viewing him as a normal criminal immediately, which becomes a huge issue later. Because now some of the government's strongest Marines are slowly starting to sympathize with the most dangerous young man in the world. And this situation only gets worse once Luffy finally enters the Grand Line. The second Luffy enters the Grand Line, the government's problems with him get way worse. Because up till now, most of the chaos around him has stayed in East Blue. A lot of high-ranking officers still believe he's some reckless troublemaker causing local problems. But the Grand Line is different. Now the people watching him include warlords, vice admirals, cipher pole agents, revolutionary spies, and eventually even the Yonko. And almost immediately, Luffy starts making enemies the government really does not want him fighting. The first massive turning point happens in Alabasta, because unlike canon, this version of Luffy already understands how corrupt parts of the governments can be before arriving there. So once he starts learning about Crocodile secretly controlling the country while being protected as a warlord, he becomes furious almost instantly. Not just because Crocodile is hurting innocent people, because the world government allowed somebody like him to gain power in the first place. And this completely changes how Luffy handles the situations. In canon, Luffy mostly fights Crocodile because Vivi is his friend and people are suffering. But here, Luffy takes the whole thing personally, because to him, Crocodile represents everything wrong with the system he grew up around. A government-backed pirate manipulating an entire kingdom while Marines do nothing because of politics. And once Luffy defeats him publicly, the government suddenly has another disaster on its hand. Because now civilians are openly asking questions again. If the Marines protect warlords like Crocodile, how many other monsters are they hiding? And the scary part is that Luffy doesn't even try to stay quiet about it. He openly criticizes the government afterwards. Not like Dragon, not like a revolutionary speech, more like pure anger. Luffy straight up says people should not blindly trust authority if the authority refuses to protect innocent people. And hearing somebody connected to the Marines say that is unbelievably dangerous. At this point, the world government starts seriously debating what to do with him, because technically Luffy is still helping people constantly. He defeats pirates, protects civilians, stops corruption. But every time he does it, the government somehow looks worse afterward. And now ordinary people across multiple islands are starting to idolize him. Not as a Marine, as something else entirely. Something in between pirate and Marine. Which is honestly even scarier for the government because they cannot control what Luffy represents anymore. Things get even more complicated once Nico Robin enters the picture. Because unlike canon, Robin becomes interested in Luffy for a completely different reason. In the original story, Robin follows Luffy because he survives impossible situations and because she slowly becomes attached to the Straw Hats emotionally. But this time, Robin sees something far more dangerous. A man raised inside the government who is slowly beginning to reject it from within. And somebody hunted by the world government for her entire life. This is fascinating. Because Robin understands something before almost anybody does. Luffy is becoming a symbol, not just another strong pirate, a symbol. And symbols are dangerous, especially symbols the government cannot silence easily. Now, this creates a very different dynamic between Robin and Luffy early on, because unlike most people around him, Robin fully understands how deep the government's corruption actually goes. She knows about Ohara, the Void Century, Cipher Pole, the cleansing operations, all the ugly things hidden beneath the surface. And once she starts explaining these pieces to Luffy, his trust in the government begins collapsing even faster. Especially after learning what happened to Ohara. Because in Luffy's mind, there is absolutely no excuse for destroying innocent civilians just to protect secrets. And this is where things start becoming really dangerous politically. Because now you have Dragon's son, Garp's grandson, somebody inspiring Marines and civilians, somebody openly questioning the government, and now he's traveling with the survivor of Ohara. That combination is basically the government's worst nightmare. At this point, Cipher Pole begins watching Luffy constantly. Not because they think he's evil, because they realize he could eventually become something much worse than a pirate. a person capable of making people stop believing in the system itself. And that becomes very important once the story reaches Water 7, because unlike canon, the conflict here becomes way more ideological. When Robin disappears and CP9 reveals themselves, this version of Luffy becomes absolutely furious, not just because his friend was taken, because the government used secret assassins to silence somebody connected to forbidden history. And once he learns the truth about Enies Lobby, the entire situation explodes, because now Luffy realizes something horrifying. The government isn't just corrupt sometimes, it's actively destroying anybody who threatens its control. And once that realization fully hits him, there's basically no going back. So when the Straw Hats arrive at Enies Lobby, the entire meaning of the arc changes. In canon, declaring war on the government is emotional and symbolic. But here, Luffy genuinely means it, because this is the moment he finally stops believing the system can be fixed from inside, and that terrifies the Marines, especially people like Sengoku and Garp, because now the government's greatest fear is becoming reality. The boy they tried to raise into perfect Marines has officially turned against them, and the worst part, a lot of soldiers secretly agree with him. The Enies Lobby incident becomes one of the biggest political disasters in government history, not just because CP9 failed, but because ordinary people begin hearing rumors about why Luffy attacked the government in the first place. Rumors about Ohara, rumors about secret assassins, rumors about corruption, and suddenly support for Luffy explodes across multiple islands, especially among younger Marines and civilians already unhappy with the government. At this point, Luffy's image completely transforms. He's no longer viewed as a strange Marine or a rebellious troublemaker. Now he's becoming something much larger, a direct challenge to the government itself. And once Ace finally gets captured, everything completely falls apart. Once Ace gets captured, the entire world basically holds its breath, because now the government has a chance to do two things at once: execute the son of Goldie Roger, and crush the growing symbol that Luffy has become. And at this point, the world government is absolutely terrified of Luffy, not because he's the strongest pirate alive yet, because people are starting to believe in him too much. Civilians are supporting him, and young Marines are admiring him. Even some experienced soldiers quietly agree with the things he says about corruption and justice. And the government realizes something horrible. If Luffy openly turns against them now, a lot of people might follow him. At the same time, Luffy is completely losing faith in the Marines after Enies Lobby, because once he learned about Ohara, Cypher Pole, and the way that government silences people, he could no longer pretend the system was secretly good underneath everything. And Ace's capture pushes him over the edge completely, because from Luffy's perspective, the government is preparing to publicly execute his brother not to protect innocent people, but to send a message, and that disgusts him. Now, unlike canon, this version of Luffy entering Marineford becomes way more complicated emotionally, because this isn't just pirates versus Marines anymore. This is basically a civil war between different ideas of justice. On the other side, you have people beginning to question whether the government even deserves that loyalty anymore. And right in the middle of it is Luffy. The moment Luffy arrives at Marineford, the entire battlefield reacts differently compared to canon, because unlike original Luffy, this version already has deep connections inside the Marines. A huge number of soldiers recognize him immediately. Some trained beside him. Some grew up hearing stories about him from Garp. Some genuinely admired him. And now they're watching the hero of the Marines' grandson arrive alongside pirates to stop the government, which completely destroys morale across parts of the battlefield. Because suddenly Marines are forced to ask themselves a terrifying question. If somebody like Luffy turned against the government, then what does he know that we don't? And that doubt spreads fast. Meanwhile, Sengoku realizes the situation is spiraling out of control almost immediately, because Luffy is no longer just some reckless pirate attacking Marine headquarters. He's a symbol now. Every word he says matters. Every action he takes matters. If Luffy publicly denounces the government during Marineford, the damage could last for years. So the government becomes completely obsessed with silencing him before he can influence more people. And this creates another massive problem, because now a huge amount of attention shifts from Whitebeard and directly onto Luffy himself. Cypher Pole agents start targeting him specifically. Vice admirals begin prioritizing him over other pirates. Some Marines even start treating him as a bigger threat than Ace. And honestly, they might be right. Because Ace threatens the government physically, Luffy threatens it ideologically. Things become even messier once Kobe finally confronts him during the war. Because unlike canon, Kobe and Luffy have years of history together now. They trained together, argued together, basically grew up together. And Kobe understands exactly why Luffy is angry at the government. The problem is that Kobe still believes the Marines can improve without completely destroying the system itself. So when the two finally meet on the battlefield, the entire conversation becomes emotional immediately. Kobe keeps trying to convince Luffy that there are still good people inside the Marines worth protecting. Meanwhile, Luffy argues the system itself is wrong and keeps forcing good people to obey evil orders. And the worst part is that neither of them fully disagree with the other, which makes the whole situation even sadder, because both of them still want justice. They just completely disagree on what justice even means anymore. At the same time, Garp is completely broken during all of this, because unlike Ken, he doesn't just feel like he failed Ace, now he feels like he failed Luffy too. The entire reason Garp brought Luffy into the Marines was to stop him from becoming somebody the government would eventually fear, and instead he accidentally created somebody even more dangerous, a man who understands the government from the inside while completely rejecting its authority. And deep down, Garp realizes something terrifying. Dragon and Luffy are actually becoming very similar, not in personality, in impact, because both of them inspire people to question the world itself. Now, eventually the war reaches its breaking point. Ace still gets freed. Akainu still provokes him. And despite everything changing in this timeline, Ace still dies protecting Luffy. Because some moments in One Piece just feel unavoidable. But Ace's death affects the version of Luffy very differently. Because unlike canon, this Luffy already spent years carrying anger toward the government before Marineford even began. So once Ace dies, that anger completely explodes. And the battlefield becomes terrifying. Conqueror's Haki erupts across Marineford far more violently than canon. Marines start collapsing everywhere. Pirates stop fighting just to stare at him. Even experienced vice admirals realize something feels different now. Because this isn't just grief anymore. This is years of frustration, betrayal, anger, and disappointment exploding all at once. And suddenly, the government realizes they made the worst possible mistake. Instead of crushing Luffy publicly, they turned him into a martyr. Now, the aftermath of Marineford changes the world permanently. Because unlike canon, people don't see Luffy as a pirate who attacked the government to save his brother. They see him as somebody who exposed the cracks inside of the entire system itself. Rumors spread everywhere afterward. Marines secretly agreeing with Luffy, corruption inside the government, the truth about Ohara, the celestial dragons, cypherpole operations. And the government cannot fully stop these rumors anymore, because too many people already witnessed Marineford itself. Even some Marines begin leaving the organization entirely afterward. Others quietly begin supporting reform movements inside the government. And some people even start viewing Luffy as the future of a completely different kind of justice altogether, which is exactly what the government feared most. After the war, Luffy completely disappears from the public eye for a while, just like canon. But unlike the original story, the government now treats him as one of the most dangerous men alive politically. Not because of his devil fruit, not because of his strength, but because of his influence. Because everywhere Luffy goes, people start questioning authority for themselves instead of blindly obeying it. And from the government's perspective, this is far more dangerous than any pirate fleet. Eventually, Luffy would still return stronger after training. He would still enter the new world, still challenge emperors, still shake the balance of the world. But now his journey means something completely different. Because this version of Luffy isn't just fighting for freedom anymore. He's fighting to completely redefine what justice means in the One Piece world. And honestly, that might make him even more dangerous than the original version of Luffy. Because Pirate Luffy fights against the government from the outside, while the Marine-raised Luffy understands exactly how to break it from within. And once somebody like Luffy decides the system itself needs to change, there's almost nothing the world government can do to stop him. But yeah, that's basically how I think the story changes if Luffy was raised by the Marines. And honestly, this might be one of my favorite what ifs so far because it changes the entire meaning of justice in One Piece instead of just making somebody stronger. Also, I want to say thanks for all of the support on these videos. I've been trying to move away from all the AI slop content that's everywhere on YouTube now, so doing actual voiceovers and putting more personality into these videos has actually been really fun. So yeah, let me know what if scenario you guys want to see next, and I'll see you in the next one.